taking care of business.
The member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On April 15th, I asked the government to prioritize both Indigenous youth and mental health, two separate but related issues. On May 28th, the government announced a renewed focus on Indigenous policy, but sadly too late for many, and the urgency to address these issues expressed last spring continues. The time has come for this government to stop reacting to issues and instead start addressing them proactively. I think we can all agree that suicide is a last resort. It is the final cry of someone who feels hopeless. This begs the question, why would an individual feel hopeless about their future in a place as wonderful and full of opportunity as Canada? Mr. Speaker, this January, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled the federal government had been discriminating against Aboriginal children by providing them inadequate access to services. Immediate relief was called for, but this government has chosen to continue to study the issues rather than act immediately. It is situations like this that feed a narrative of hopelessness in Indigenous communities as the federal government actively chooses to ignore its obligations and promises. Just last week, the tribunal issued a second compliance order to force the government to take immediate action and to rectify funding shortfalls to ensure First Nations children who primarily live on reserve have access to public services on the same terms as all Canadian children. When will the government recognize and dismantle the systemic discrimination embedded in this country's policies towards Aboriginal peoples? Mental health is too often spoken about in a manner that homogenizes an individual's experiences. The common discourse places people in subgroups with labels, removing agency from the way they are feeling. Aboriginal peoples are often subjected to the same treatment. The experiences of one group become generalized into the national narrative as the experiences of all Aboriginal peoples or communities. This past March, 3 Saskatchewan First Nations declared a state of emergency after 4 people died in one day. 3 of the deaths were attributed to prescription drug overdoses. Ted Quasion, Senate Chair with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, was quoted in response to this tragic announcement saying, "A normal person goes to about 7 to 10 funerals in his lifetime, and you know what? I've been to 400 funerals in my 3 communities." The passive action to address the state of mental health in Aboriginal communities is simply unacceptable. While the government's promise of more permanent health care workers for communities identified as high risk does address the immediate concerns, it is a Band-Aid solution that fails to address the root of addiction and mental health issues. Ryan Jimmy of Saskatoon recognizes the intersectionalities of Aboriginal people are battling while trying to receive proper access to service. He has created the hub at the University of Saskatchewan, which consists of solely Aboriginal-focused research. It is aimed at experiences of depression, suicide, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with an explicit acknowledgement of the long-term effects of residential schools and the 60 scoops have had on Aboriginal people today. Mr. Speaker, when will we see this government taking an active stance and creating groundbreaking, long-term, sustainable programs like the Hub instead of some of the same old solutions that maintain the status quo? With meaningful investments and the simple fulfillment of our obligation to Indigenous communities, I hope my community and our country will see fewer funerals for our youth and more high school graduations. There are steps this government can take immediately. Will the government commit now to working with Indigenous communities and their agencies to use the money where it can make the most difference? Thank you.
The Honourable